Many thanks, Clarence, for inviting me and giving me the chance to talk about an issue which I think is really important for science as a whole, but particularly to myself and colleagues at Nekton and Oxford, as well as collaborators such as Professor Al from De La Salle University. So without further ado, first of all, what is parachute science? I'm aware that some of you might not have heard of the term before, so I'm going to start rather unconventionally with a very short sort of clip. Hopefully it will play, where two of my collaborators sort of explain what it is. Let's see if it... Oh, I just realized that I probably didn't do the thing where you listen, where you can actually listen to what it says. So that's my mistake. So I'm going to have to explain what parachute science is myself. So the person here depicted here is Sheena Talma. She's one of Nekton's, the science program manager. And what she was going to say is that parachute science is essentially the practice whereby international scientists conduct fieldwork in other nations, which we term host nations, and then complete the research in their home country without necessarily engaging in any further communication or other researchers from that nation. So what it creates is it creates a dependency on external expertise, and it does not address local research needs. Essentially, some of you might have also heard other terms that are sort of synonyms of parachute science. You might have heard of terms such as colonial science or parasitic science or helicopter science. These have been documented over the last couple of years in different articles at different journals. Essentially, they all refer to the same thing. It's scientists from typically wealthy nations going and conducting research, fieldwork, data collection that is generated in lower income nations, and then they go on and publish papers and sort of build up their academic careers, if you like, without necessarily sort of valuing the contribution from host nation scientists. And touch a little bit on the impacts. I'm going to give a bit more detail on what it sort of problems it creates. First of all, it creates a dependency on external expertise. If you don't have effective collaboration and knowledge exchange activities between the foreign and the local scientists, there really is no opportunity for any skills to be developed. Therefore, host nation scientists will always remain dependent on that specific skill of expertise that they might have needed. It also does not address local research needs because in many cases, the questions have not been put forward by the actual scientists living in those areas. So a lot of the products from parachute science research or projects is in many cases not as relevant or applicable to the communities living there. It also actively hinders local research efforts. For example, if you try and exclude host nation scientists from meaningfully engaging or leading parts of a project, no leadership opportunities within those host nation scientists develop, and then there is less international recognition, which means in scientific terms usually less papers. And of course that is one of the attributes that sometimes makes a scientist sort of successful, and it gives them a better opportunity to actually be able to access additional funding opportunities. And so if you don't have effectively, parachute science also limits, like the success of applications that host nation scientists can make in the future on their own. So it's actively undermining them. And of course, because of all of these behaviors, this will ultimately result in a lack of trust between foreign researchers that are usually viewed as exploitative sometimes by stakeholders and governments of lower income nations. And something that usually is not mentioned enough is that there is also, apart from the impacts on people that receive parachute science practices, is also the parachute scientists themselves. They also lose out of all of this. So if you have ineffective collaborations and unbalanced partnerships, this will exclude the parachute scientists from a wealth of knowledge that and traditional ecological knowledge that is usually residing in host nation scientists. So if host nation scientists were included from the very beginning of a research project and throughout its duration, it's likely that there would have been more appropriate questions asked, and the interpretation of the results would have been more realistic, because there is all that knowledge that is usually not included in the discussion. So where does it occur? Well, unfortunately, it occurs in a lot of different research fields. I think for the past decades, probably people like sort of regarded it as the norm. They didn't necessarily consider it was an unfair research practice. It's only lately that people started sort of discussing those issues and trying to find a way forward. For example, in global health research, what happens very often is you have an outbreak of a virus in a particular country, such as the Ebola outbreak in Western Africa, or like the Zika outbreak in Brazil. And researchers from wealthy nations will flock into the country, try and, or in the area, collect sort of samples and data from patients to try and study the disease. And then what they do is they go back into their country, they develop a treatment, and then that same treatment is being sold to the very same countries that have helped create it in a very non-affordable price. So that sort of, you can see, creates like a problem. And then other fields, I'm going to pick another example, for example, geoscience, where there was this recent paper that showed that over the last 5 decades, the contribution of the whole continent of Africa, so all the scientists working in Africa, they produced as many papers as a small nation in northwestern Europe, Netherlands. That's about 2%. And then they found also that from all the papers that have been published in geoscience and relating to the African continent, about 30% of them did not exclude any African scientists. So that's another example of parachute science, of course. Now, today I'm going to focus a little bit more on marine research, and that's because I'm a marine biologist by training, so I know this field much better than all the other ones. So particularly, we're going to be focusing on coral reefs. Probably most of you are aware of them, but in case not, coral reefs, warm water coral reefs, they're complex ecosystems and they're restricted. Their distribution is restricted in the tropics and in the subtropics. Coral reefs, of course, are not just corals. They provide complex habitats that support a great diversity of reef-associated fauna and flora. They are incredibly diverse. So they have about 25% of all known marine diversity worldwide. And they provide a range of ecosystem services from fisheries, coastal protection, ecotourism, you name it. And because of that, they're vital for the survival and prosperity of millions, if not billions, worldwide. Now, because they are such global hotspots of marine biodiversity and the immense scientific and sort of value that they have, for generations, it was the center of attention of a lot of marine scientists. So therefore, it was a very common occurrence, and still is, that scientists from wealthy nations or institutions, including myself, often go into coral reef-rich countries in the tropics to conduct field work, collect data, and unfortunately, in many cases, it's not happening in an equitable and fair manner. But so far, there hasn't been necessarily quantifiable evidence to try and sort of put a number behind this phenomenon. Now, the reason why it's sometimes important to give numbers behind a phenomenon is because it's much easier to sort of communicate it with others, and potentially others that can make a difference. And we can talk later on about how we can all make a difference. So that paper was published in Current Biology this year. So what we try and did there is we try and assess the extent of parachute science, particularly focusing on coral reef biodiversity research as a proxy. And we used publication-related metrics, that is authorship patterns, which I'm going to explain a little bit more later on, to try as a proxy for effective scientist-to-scientist communication and engagement. And we did this using the database Scopus. And we looked over the last 50 years at all the papers that have been published in this field. And then we try and check authorship patterns to see and effectively quantify parachute science. Now, before we go to the authorship patterns themselves, what we did find is at a global scale, one thing that was sort of like strikingly obvious was that the top 10 countries with most number of reef publications worldwide, only 2 of them are from lower or middle income nations, for example, Mexico or Indonesia, while the 2 of the other countries, which are all high income, actually Canada and Germany, they don't even have any coral reefs at all, but they still feature in the top 10. And then if you see the graph on the right, You can also notice, which shows essentially the countries with most coral reefs worldwide. You can see that this mismatch between research output, that is the number of publications, and countries with most coral reefs. And you can see that only Indonesia and Australia are actually prolific in terms of literature and also featuring in the countries with most coral reefs. So this is, to me, this is a clear sort of example of Western intellectual sort of colonialism, where all the ideas, the concepts about an ecosystem is being made by the West. And that ecosystem is not, in most cases, in the waters, or it's in much lower quantities. And that's predominantly affecting people's lives in the tropics. So look, going from the global sort of scale picture, we then decided to focus on 3 countries. Specifically, we decided to focus on Indonesia, a lower to middle income country, Australia, a high income country, and the Philippines, a lower to middle income country again. And the reason why we focused on those is, as you saw from the previous graph, these were the top 3 nations in terms of warm water coral reef habitat globally. Now, what you can see in those graphs, you can see the numbers of papers that have been published per year, and they have been color-coded to reflect the different authorship patterns. For example, black means no host nation scientist. That is the scientist that from the nation where the field research was conducted. That black means no host nation scientists were included. Blue refers to host nation scientists were included as middle authors. Pink is when the paper had a host nation scientist as a lead or a senior author. That is the last author. And then yellow is when the paper had only one host nation scientist. And then yellow is when everyone was from the host nation. So that's papers with authors from the host nation. By analyzing then, based on this results, the authorship patterns, we find that about 40% of publications that were published in Indonesia and the Philippines, they actually had no host nation scientists included, whereas the respective figure for Australia, a high-income nation, was about half that. And then when we were looking at research leadership, now remember that was defined as the number of publications where host nation scientists were either leading or being the senior author. We found that this number was much higher in Australia. It was 66% compared to Indonesia, where it was 30%, and compared to Philippines, where it was 40%. Now, of course, exclusion of host nation scientists, looking at this over time, if you like, or inclusion of them over as middle authors, was worse in the 1970s and 80s, but it was sort of gradually getting better, although it is still present in numbers that should not be acceptable from 2010 and onwards. One of the reasons why the co-authors of the paper believe that between 2010 and 2020, for example, in the Philippines and Indonesia, there was an increase. As you can see, there is a lot of yellow of publications from authors, all from the host nation, is that because there has been an increase in local funding availability, and the scope of reef research has also expanded. So it moved on from taxonomic inventories and resource assessments to actually reef restoration and climate change. And at least in the case of Indonesia, some policy changes that have been passed in 2017 actually do require researchers to publish scientific papers for professional incentives. So that might have been one of the reasons also why we see an enhanced research output in Indonesia. And then this graph essentially shows the number of studies which do mention a permit number. Now, permit number or exemption notification are both prerequisites to conduct field work or sample collection in any marine setting. And we can see that about 10% in the case of Philippines, up to 25% in the case of Australia. Only 10 to 25% of all papers do mention specifically a permit number. Now, of course, not mentioning a permit number in a publication does not necessarily indicate that, you know, like there was some sort of unethical or illegal activity taking place. But based from the co-author's experience, this have been the case, at least this must have been the case in at least some of the publications. Now, if you combine everything sort of together, it becomes sort of clear that from the above results that the extent of parachute science is actually more prevalent in low to middle income nations and not so common in high income nations, even though it does still exist there. Parachute science is still widespread in marine science and coral reef biodiversity research in particular. And as we have explained, and we will do also later on, this benefits nobody, both the host nation scientists, but also the scientists conducting parachute science. It has no benefit in the long run. So where does this sort of lead us? What should the next steps would be? 2021 to 2030, it has been proclaimed as the United Nations Decade of Ocean Science for Sustainable Development. And some of the sort of mission statements include words such as building capacity, developing scientific knowledge, building and sharing infrastructure, fostering partnerships between member states for sustainable and healthy ocean. Now, the tricky bit is how to implement those and how to do that. So what we believe is that this can only be achieved if we all try and adopt a research culture that is more ethical and equitable, and where partnerships, knowledge exchange activities, mutual trust, and respect between researchers and host nation scientists and international researchers are actually at the heart of all research projects, and they become the rule and not the exception. And obviously, for that to happen, we must exclude the practices of parachute sciences. And because of that, when we wrote the paper, we thought it's not enough to just try and document a phenomenon. It's also very helpful in many cases to try and come up with some recommendations. So these are some of the recommendations we came up, and they sort of apply to international scientists conducting field work in other locations, as well as publishers. So the sort of recommendation is find academic collaborators. Start with host country institutions that have a national reach or scope. You can use online databases such as Scopus, Web of Science, Google Scholar to try and locate the most relevant individuals and learn more about their work. You should also try and look at articles that are published in host country journals, including university in-house journals, because they can provide more insights into the work and the expertise of potential collaborators. An in-country visit or in COVID-19 times, sometimes a webinar might be the only thing possible. Very early on in a new project is very advantageous, and because it will help identify the most appropriate collaborators and foster those relationships going forward. So we strongly recommend that. Liaise with government funding bodies and of the host nation. Now, these can usually connect you with suitable collaborators, and especially with a track record who have delivering on research grants. Another recommendation is develop a joint research agenda. This is very central. So once collaborators have been identified and before even fieldwork takes place, we strongly encourage extensive consultation to take place with all the host nation stakeholders so that the research agenda is jointly framed and addresses local research needs, because that's when the results of that project will actually create the most relevant and actionable sort of data sets for the local communities. Now, a point that is very close to my heart, because I still consider myself an early career scientist, is engaged with the next generation of researchers. So by building and establishing internships or exchange programs between the partnering institutions, then they can sort of supervise promising early career researchers and other students. Now, this will, of course, provide benefits both for the supervisor and the students, but it will also help develop local talent, which is ultimately what's needed, the leadership and local talent, which will, in time, will make host nation countries less reliant on foreign expertise. Sharing academic literature. A lot of you might know that, of course, a lot of articles are behind expensive paywalls, and a lot of people like cannot necessarily access them. So what in international projects, scientists from high-income countries could, for example, share copies of key papers with their collaborators in lower-income nations who might not have access to those papers, share even whole private collections, and where possible, they can make those personal collections available to the local universities so that more people can actually make use of them. Obviously, know the regulatory landscape. This has become pretty standard lately, but many countries are wary of specific research themes. So, for example, regulatory bodies and agencies have specific guidelines to try and vet applicants and applications in terms of what samples you can take and if you can take them out of the country and what sort of results and who owns the ownership of the results and any sort of intellectual information that comes out of those. So having effective partnerships to try and navigate through all of these requirements from is really useful. And of course, we don't have to forget that many institutions actually themselves require better host country engagement as part of the research ethics approval. So these were all for the scientists. And then a final point that it relates to publishers, scientific publishers, it's transparency in publishing. So journals could also make it mandatory for authors to provide research permits or research ethics numbers, and editors and reviewers should be encouraged to confirm the existence of those in case they are not mentioned, and agree as like to a template, a justification, if you like, as to why this was not needed if it wasn't needed. In the same ways that other studies in other fields conducting experiments using animals, for example, they have to have an ethical approval, otherwise stated clear in the paper, otherwise the paper is not accepted. So in terms of publishing, there have been some first steps. For example, you have journals like The Lancet Global Health, which has recently taken a stance against submissions that appear to make use of local infrastructure, personnel, or patients without recognizing contributions from host nation researchers. And also in the beginning of 2021, Cell Press journals have introduced an inclusion and diversity statement, which give authors who submit papers the opportunity to highlight what efforts did they took in order to try and avoid parachute science practices. So these are good steps towards the right direction. Unfortunately, for now, it's very few journals that have done this. So hopefully in the next couple of months, years, more journals and scientific publishers will follow their example. Now, of course, a lot of the recommendations that we have sort of made mostly concern scientists conducting international fieldwork as well as publishers, but there are other players that are very key to try and combat the practice of parachute sciences. We have, for example, academic and research institutions, ethics committees, and research funders. For example, one common complaint made by researchers in wealthy institutions or wealthy nations is that engagement takes time and it takes funds. And because these are not specifically allocated in the research budgets, or it's not necessarily being valued as much during a career review, for example, of the researcher, they don't necessarily spend as much time doing that. So, for example, in order to change that, academic and research institutions should try and value and promote research that is truly collaborative, and they should reward the individuals that do it. So instead of just focusing on the number of papers or the impact factor of the journal, they should also try and take into account, how collaborative and how truly sort of meaningful an international project collaboration is. And then institution committees which approve ethic applications, they should also make it a requirement to have good host country engagement throughout all of the stages of a project. And finally, research funders, they should make sure that projects have specific funds allocated for partnership, engagement, and other knowledge exchange activities. And when they try and review applications, is to give the same weight to those activities as well as to the number of publications and, like the impact factor of the journals. So if everyone sort of tries to do their bit, I think the situation can change. Now, all of these recommendations that we have made for researchers and all these other like bodies, they fall under the banner of transdisciplinary research. So we recently published a paper that was about 2 weeks ago in Biology Letters with colleagues from Seychelles, and we highlighted the mutual benefits of truly collaborative, multi-stakeholder international projects that are built on the principles of co-development, co-production, and co-dissemination. So unlike parachute science, this practice advocates a transdisciplinary approach to science, hence the term transdisciplinary research, and it values the process of national leadership of the host nation and engagement from the inception of the project all the way to the end of it, which will ultimately provides mutual benefits for all stakeholders involved. So at the core, as you can see sort of from the figure there, the research process has legacy at its center, and it's supported by communication and ocean literacy activities throughout. So the process usually starts with joint framing of the research agenda, which we already have suggested, with an extensive range of stakeholders. Subsequently, this agenda is translated into specific research questions that are of interest to the different partners. And the agreed research is then jointly planned, it's jointly conducted, and all the data and results that are generated are analyzed and interpreted collaboratively. All the new findings then, they are disseminated across the partners and stakeholders in a parallel manner, not at the very end, once the paper has been written, and with a specific focus on what the audience actually needs to know about those particular findings, because different audiences, have different interests in terms of the importance of the findings. And finally, all the collected samples and data and any generated knowledge, outputs and products, they should be appropriately curated at the end of it. We also provide a test case where such an approach, has been followed. The example we provide is the First Descent Seychelles project, which started in 2019. So what happened there is at the invitation of the government of Seychelles, the UK NGO Nekton, for which I work for, facilitated an expedition. It was conducted by Seychellois partners who were coordinated by the Ministry of Agriculture, Climate Change and Environment and other international scientists. And they provided data and conclusions about deep reefs, so all the reefs between 30 and 250 meters across the Seychelles outer islands. So we also provided some example sort of activities that were undertaken throughout all stages of the project, that is before, during and after fieldwork took place. These are of course some examples of what was done. They're not intended to be a roadmap for projects in other nations with other partnerships, but they rather provide sort of some concrete examples of what has been successful. So by acknowledging the historic and contemporary power balances and dynamics, because Seychelles was, for example, a former British colony that became independent republic in 1976, it was important for this project to place the Seychelles partners at the center of the decision-making and communications from the very start. So this helped ensure enhanced engagement and interest from the resident population, who are actually very crucial in order to ensure that there is a long-lasting legacy of the project once it finishes. So we aim to create all together, when I say we, us that conducted the research from the foreign country with our Seychellois partners, we aim to create shared goals that were needs-led, and activities and findings that were transparent and open. To do this, we had to consult continuously with policymakers and scientists alike, and everyone was involved in all stages of the project. And then all of the goals and findings that were communicated pluralistically, depending on the context, in order to try and communicate those benefits and knowledge across the different team members. Of course, we also presented some reflections of what worked well and what didn't work that well. Unexpected benefits because of open dialogue with the stakeholders and the government. throughout the stages of the project. This, for example, facilitated approval of amended field locations because the weather was very bad when we were on the field, and that was granted while we were on the ship. So that meant, for example, that we didn't have to waste any time while at sea because we already had those good working relations and everything could be done quicker. Challenges will occur, but if you have the right process in places, this can sort of minimize the disruption. So you have to try and build relationships that that are flexible, and they do not, and even if they do not succeed in their original form, because of you can try and find a way out of it. So very good thing that we did, and we think it worked really well, is we designated a partnership personnel which was based in the host nation country, which is and they helped with coordinating all the national and international partners in order to try and maintain momentum. Now, if experience and equipment permits, it's really important to try and develop a regional dimension of knowledge sharing. So for example, in this case, between Seychelles and other neighboring nations, and not necessarily only between Seychelles and the UK. Now, this regional aspect is really important because this will provide opportunities for regional knowledge networks to develop, expert hubs, and essentially they will be less reliant on, on countries that are not even like in the region. Clear communication is important, but it's not always very easy. So you have to sort of tailor your communications approach and how you communicate with all the different partners to meet their expectations and try and work together to overcome any issues. Nothing is, of course, perfect, and of course, mistakes have been made, but long-term partnerships are really viable. So the experience of working together is really useful in order to try and, correct mistakes that might have been made during this phase in future projects. So that's why we think it's really important to try and be more reflective and critical at the end of a project to try and see what worked, what didn't work well, to try and correct it the next time around. So I'm almost at the end of my presentation. So we looked at parachute science, and we looked at ways that we can do to sort of combat and eliminate the practices of parachute science. So I'm going to end up this talk by a quote by our science program manager, Sheena Talma. And she says, "Parachute science is complex, multi-layered, and historical. The solution is not only about including more local scientists and publications, but about building relationships, developing knowledge exchange activities, and having mutual trust and respect between all parties. Local scientists have a lot to offer foreign researchers, and building those partnerships enables skills sharing and empowers people on the ground to continue the work once the foreign scientists leave." And this is just a slide for all the different references that I have used in the talk. I'm happy to provide those to anyone who is interested to learn more about the topic. And there is some sort of further reading suggestions from popular articles covering the topic. So thank you for listening to me.